All right, thank you for coming, everybody. This is our first keynote address for our conference on taxation and development, hosted by the Center for Development Economics. Our speaker tonight is Lucy Martin, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She has a PhD in political science and an MA in economics from Yale University. Her book, Strategic Taxation, was published in 2023 by Oxford University Press and is the 2024 co-winner of the American Political Science Association's William H. Riker Book Award for the best book in political economy. She has also published work in the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, Political Behavior, and on and on. Her work demonstrates, among other things, that when governments tax their citizens and succeed in collecting taxes, that increases demands for accountability. And the citizens tend to demand more public services and demand more out of their governments and punish them for doing a bad job and reward them for doing a good job. And it turns out a lot of governments don't want to be accountable. So a lot of her work also considers how that plays out in the politics of developing countries. So please join me in welcoming Lucy Martin.
Thank you, John, for the very kind introduction. I'm going to move this down to my height. Thanks also for inviting me and for everyone coming out at 8 o'clock on a Thursday to hear a talk about taxation. I want to talk about how I got into tax research, especially I think as one of the only political scientists in the room right now. So when I started graduate school, I was really interested in state development. I was interested in democratization. I was interested in accountability. And I really saw taxation as possibly the most boring thing you could possibly study in that. But I started doing field work. I started talking to people, especially in countries like Uganda, and realizing that it was actually quite central to the things that I really cared about. And after that, studying taxation is clearly its own reward, and that's why we're all here today. So, why taxation? Well, I've promised that I will keep this mic attached to me. So, there's a broad sense in the literature on political economy that taxation really has a special role to play in state development, both historically and today. Correlationally, at least, it's linked to better state capacity, especially bureaucratic capacity, which a lot of you are literally part of in your day-to-day jobs, better accountability, and higher levels of democracy, right? And this is commonly taken to imply that if low-income countries and middle-income countries could extract more in taxes, they'd be a lot better off in a lot of different ways. Not only from the revenue they could collect and the public goods you could provide, but for all these spillover benefits that taxation provides. And then we look at actual tax revenues, and we can really see the extent to which low and medium-income countries are lagging behind, right? There's clearly been improvements. You can look here. You can see that compared to 2000, low-income countries are collecting almost 50% more tax as a share of the GDP, but it's still much, much below the 20+% the average high-income country collects, let alone the 40+% that a lot of European welfare states collect. And while, again, there's been movement and improvements over time, the overall patterns aren't changing much. At the same time, there's a huge amount of variation in tax GDP ratios, even within a given income bracket. So we can see that two countries like, say, Kenya and Ghana, which are both lower and middle income, Kenya collects significantly more in taxes. Right? And this has led to a broad, huge, enormous literature on why is taxation so low and how do we actually improve it. And the fundamental answer here for a long time has often been that we just need more state capacity. Even a lot of the measures we use of state capacity in academic work are simply how much tax can a government extract. And with state capacity, the answer, what that really means is we often assume the solutions are bureaucratic. And I don't want to underplay them, right? Bureaucratic solutions to collecting taxes are clearly incredibly important. But I don't think that's all of what it is, right? So this graphic on the right is taken from a World Bank report where it's arguing for different ways to increase taxation. The vast majority of that report is about tax administration systems. It's about collecting information. It's about digitizing taxes. And then you kind of get one little point here about, well, maybe we should also build trust, boost accountability, right? I think there's a missing component to a lot of the work on taxation, or at least there's two literatures that don't always talk to each other enough. where taxation is also low because of the political constraints that leaders face. So what I want to do today is start by talking about, just historically, back in the dawn of time, meaning sort of 14 to 1800s Europe, why do we think taxation was so beneficial to state development in so many ways? And then think through why do we think those dynamics, or how do we think those dynamics might be different for modern developing countries? Right. And I want to use that to start talking about when do we think taxation is going to be politically feasible? Right? When are governments actually going to have the incentive to tax, and when are they going to be able to do it successfully? My main argument, which is drawn from my book, is that there are still strong reasons to think that taxation is going to be good for accountability and good for state development today. But it's going to be a bit more constrained. It's only going to happen under certain conditions, and we need to consider a bit more about when governments are actually going to be willing to tax. Okay. Especially if, as John mentioned, taxation generates higher pressures from citizens. Okay. I want to stress that in all of this, I'm not going to show you a shred of evidence. If you want that, if you want the theoretical models, if you want the evidence, you can go read a 50-page formal model in my book. I want to focus on the broad themes here. Okay. But I want to finish by talking a little bit about what I see as some interesting ongoing questions in tax research, areas where I think there's a lot of room for development. So, let's start with Europe, right? There's this classic theory in the political economy literature of very long standing at this point, that the key to developing strong states in Europe was interstate war. That if you're a monarch or a prince in Europe, the main threat to your survival was invasion from your neighbors. Okay. So the problem with that is that if you want to succeed, if you want to survive as a country, you need to be able to wage war. War, however, is just expensive. You have to pay armies. Leaders that do not pay their armies typically do not survive for very long. You also need to be able to buy weapons, you need to buy supplies, and this gets more and more of a binding constraint as the technology of warfare starts to evolve. Right? Which means if you want to be able to wage war, you need revenue to do so, if you're going to do it successfully. One way to do that is simply to get elites to pay taxes. This is historically one of the things we see, where elites here are going to be large landowners, they might be large merchants, wealthy merchants. But often that's going to take too long, right? You're being invaded today, you can't send your tax collectors out and come back in 6 months or wait until the harvest. So instead what happens is most leaders end up getting loans with the understanding that they'll be able to pay back those loans using taxes. And so the countries that are able to get loans are ultimately still those that can extract tax revenue, or at least not at completely ruinous interest rates. The result there is that rulers who are able to tax are the ones who survive. States that can develop tax capacity are able to wage war successfully, they win wars, they survive. Ones that don't tend to disappear over the course of a few hundred years. England's given as one of the classic examples of this. Also, a lot of the Italian city-states that survive, again, are those that are able to raise revenue. Okay. What this leads to, though, is the problem of how are you actually going to tax? And there's really two ways to do it, but most of the time here, again, you're taxing wealthy elites. You're not doing broad-based taxes on all your citizens. You're taxing a small section of the richest population. Okay. One option is simply to make people pay. This is the traditional approach to taxation historically. But if you're going to do that, you start to need to know a little bit more, right? You need to know something about the economic activity in your territory. You need people who can collect taxes. This is often impetus for starting to professionalize the bureaucracy. And so what we start to see is that even if you're taxing coercively, it's going to have positive benefits for state capacity because you have to build up the ability to actually extract taxes. And again, this can work. It obviously is the traditional approach to tax, but it's also expensive. You can end up spending a lot of revenue just going and trying to measure what people have, collecting the tax, chasing people who are trying to hide their sheep from you. And especially for some income types where it is hideable, where it is movable property, it might be quite hard to extract revenue. Right? So what we start to see the emergence of, and the other big part of this traditional literature, is tax bargaining. That if you can get citizens to pay voluntarily or quasi-voluntarily, then you can collect more revenue at a smaller cost and you're better off. The trick is to do that, you might have to give citizens something in return. Okay. Historically, one of the things this looked like is basically political representation. This is one of the arguments for how Parliament emerges originally in England, why you get some form of representative councils in a lot of city-states, and also policy concessions. Right? So elites say, we will pay taxes, but in return we want some control over how they're raised, what we're paying, and we want some control often over how the taxes are being spent. But in return, We'll stop fighting you. We'll give you the taxes. You can wage your wars. We'll survive as a state. So there's two approaches here. They both lead to stronger states in a lot of ways, right? You're still going to have a state that's able to survive. You're probably still going to have a stronger bureaucracy no matter what. And so over time, countries that can tax survive. Countries that can't tax tend to disappear. This means there's just really strong political incentives for leaders to tax. We start getting better bureaucracies, some form of representative institutions. Let's not take this too far. These are oligarchies, right? This is not broad-based representative democracy. This is a handful of landowners who suddenly have something called a parliament, and potentially policy concessions as well. That some of the revenue is spent on something that these elites in parliament start to want as well, right? And over the period of hundreds of years, you see multiple rounds of this, and democracy and taxation sort of skip down history's lane hand in hand. Governments start raising more revenue, they start becoming more democratic, and by the 20th century and the world wars, we start to see the mass franchise. We also start to see really broad demands for redistribution. Government meets those demands, taxes go up, and we end up with sort of these high democracy, high accountability, high capacity states in Western Europe today. This is basically the virtuous cycle, right? And this is what all those hopes that raising taxation in low and middle income countries will for what it will do comes really out of this story, that we think this is what's happened. So the next question is, do we think that should still happen? Do we think the European story does travel? Do we think it should travel? Under what conditions? Because times have changed, right? We no longer have leaders riding around on horseback waving swords, except metaphorically. So I want to talk through three main ways I think early modern Europe and 21st century states are different in ways that are really meaningful for taxation. Okay. The first is the type of threats they face to the survival. Again, early modern Europe, we're talking about interstate war, right? We're talking about external threats. What's happened? This is not how it's supposed to play out. Okay, here we go. We're doing this anyway. Okay, revenue sources. Right? In the early modern period, we really have taxes. You have a limited number of tax instruments that you're going to levy on elites. You have access to debt, but even debt is predominantly going to be through internal creditors. There's not a huge international bond market. You're borrowing money from elites in your own country, with some exceptions, but this is the most common source of debt revenue. And if we look at democracy, it tends to be fairly closely linked to taxation, where again, expansion of political power and expansion of tax capacity tend to go hand in hand over a long period. Okay, so we can look at these same three factors and look at them in the 21st century, right? So before we had interstate war, until a couple of years ago, interstate war was very, very uncommon today. But for a lot of states, really, the key threats they're facing are internal and external. President Museveni of Uganda is not sitting there worrying that Kenya is going to invade. He's worried about coups, he's worried about protests, he's worried about losing power in an election. So these survival incentives and what leaders are worried about are incredibly different. Revenue sources are also really different. There's still taxation. I'll talk in a minute about at least a couple of the ways we think it's different as well. There's still debt, but now credit looks really differently. Most low-income countries can still have domestic credit, right? About half of Ghana's sovereign debt is owned to domestic creditors, but it's much, much more international. I think that's going to change the dynamics as well, not to mention the fact that we now have things like oil money, foreign aid, all these resource rents, and kind of windfall revenues that states did not used to have access to. And finally, if we look at the way democracy has emerged for a lot of developing countries, it's not closely linked to taxation in the same way. I don't think anyone would argue that the wave of democratizations in the 1990s is because countries were taxing more. Instead, we think that there's probably a lot more other pressures. There's the end of the Cold War, international system, economic crisis. But again, the idea that taxation is what's leading to democracy doesn't make a ton of sense in the modern period. Right? So we have all these differences, right? And taxation's changed too. This picture is not actually super relevant. I just really, really like this tax. This is a receipt from 1755 from the British window tax, where you were taxed on the number of windows your domicile had. This is why if you go around England, you will see a lot of bricked up windows as an early form of trying to minimize your tax liability, okay? But the actual point here is that early modern taxation looks really different. You don't have an income tax. You don't have broad-based sales taxes because they're just really hard to do. You either you have much narrower kind of excise taxes, tariffs, things like that. the types of tax instruments that we have now are much, much broader, right? So since 1960, we're, I think, now in one of the only countries in the world that does not have a national sales tax, let alone a value-added tax, right? You could not do this tax 100 years ago, 200 years ago. It's just not administratively feasible, right? So taxation's changed a lot too. So what do we think these changes actually mean? There's some things that have stayed the same. Governments do still need revenue, right? Every government would like to have more money. Every government has stuff it would like to do with that money. But now you have a lot more alternatives and a lot wider range of tax instruments you could use to actually implement those policies. What this suggests is that governments can be a bit more strategic about the types of taxes they choose. They just have a lot more options. Another thing that stayed the same is the absolute fundamental tenet of political science as a discipline, which is that leaders like to keep being leaders and stay in power. If this goes away, we're all in trouble, right? But again, it's still a bit different. Survival incentives have changed. We're not as worried about interstate war anymore. Now we're much more worried, politicians in developing countries are often much more worried about internal threats from their own people, from their own armies. What this is going to suggest is that there can be a very different political calculus about the effects of taxation on your own political survival. And in particular, whereas taxation used to be how you survive, now it can actually make you very vulnerable in a way that perhaps it did not used to. And I think these dynamics and how they interact is really amplified by the fact that taxation gives citizens different ways of actually enacting leverage over government and making demands. I want to talk briefly about those. There's really two pathways that I think are important here, right? The first one is the threat of noncompliance. This is the traditional kind of tax bargaining story. When citizens are being taxed, they can simply threaten to not pay the tax and try and exert pressure on government that way. This is the basis for tax bargaining. We certainly think that can still happen. It can be fairly explicit. There's nice case studies of things like Somaliland over the past 20 years where you do actually see something that looks a lot like traditional tax bargaining between leaders and some of the merchant elites. But it can also be much more general. So if we look at theories like fiscal exchange, like tax morale, that this is really also sort of based on the fact that we think citizens are more likely to pay taxes if they feel like they're getting something in return. Okay. The second pathway is one that's come out theoretically much more recently. This is a lot of my own work, but also the work of others. The taxation also makes citizens a lot more willing to use other channels of action to punish leaders they think are not accountable. Right? A lot of my own work has shown that it can make people more upset when government uses funds, when they're more willing to punish corruption or punish misuse. There's also work by others showing that taxation can make people more willing to actually seek information about what government's doing. It can actually change beliefs about state capacity, where if people start to believe the government has more capacity to do things like deliver goods, that raises expectations that can also change citizen behavior. These often get conflated in the political economy literature in a way that I think can be a little misleading, and I think it's useful to help sort this out a little bit, right? Because these paths rely on really different levers, and they're going to operate under a different set of scope conditions. So if we look at the tax bargaining mechanism, that's the one that's going to rely on the threat of non-compliance. Well, for that to hold, it can't hold if taxation's fully coercive, right? If it's a tax that the government can just collect incredibly easily, can force you to pay, either because it's easy to collect or because there's high penalties, tax bargaining is not really going to be on the table. You can't threaten to withhold taxes, right? For those of us who have, in the US, are about to or have already submitted our taxes because we enjoy working on tax stuff, the government has my W-2. I can't just pretend that UNC didn't pay me this year, right? But critically, it doesn't rely on regime type as much, right? Provided there's some room for non-compliance, it doesn't necessarily matter if you're in a democracy or an autocracy. The other pathway, this punishment mechanism, doesn't rely on non-compliance, right? So in that case, even if a tax is very coercive, it could still lead citizens to demand more for their leaders, more likely to punish them. But on the flip side, regime type might matter a lot more. If government's too repressive, if there aren't free and fair elections, if you can't go protest, this is going to be a lot harder to do, right? No one thinks that the problem with North Korea is they just need to tax more. We don't think that's suddenly going to lead to accountability demands in democracy, right? And clearly taxation is much, much older than the idea of government accountability. Okay. But what this starts to do is suggest scope conditions about where we think these are actually going to hit, and the types of taxes, or the types of citizens, and types of regimes where we think this is going to apply. Right? But I think a key implication is that these factors, if you're a government and you have a wide variety of tax instruments to choose, you can think about how they're going to affect these two levers and try and plan accordingly. So, all this is building up to when do we actually think that governments are going to tax their citizens? Okay. I'm not subjecting you to game theory. We're going to do it in words, but this is basically what we're doing here. Imagine a leader, you could say a president, an MP, head of a local government, a mayor, who has some level of revenue, right? Maybe from taxes, maybe from aid, maybe from oil, and they have a set of decisions they need to make. Let's say they want more revenue, there's something they want to do. The first decision is simply, should they increase taxation? And to help us think it through, I want to think about a sort of stylized case where you're considering bringing a new group of citizens into the tax net. Maybe you have a group of informal sector workers and you want to know, can you actually tax them? So you can decide to tax or not tax, fairly easy. If you decide to tax, you have to decide how are you actually going to enforce the tax. You could choose to tax more coercively, try to invest in administration, try to have something where you're not really giving people the opportunity for non-compliance, or you can try to bargain with citizens and try to get some kind of fiscal exchange mechanism or tax bargaining going on. Obviously, in the real world, these are not mutually exclusive, right? Most governments are going to rely on a mix of them. I think it's helpful to think about these as stylized cases for now. Okay. And let's say you successfully tax, you get some revenue. How are you actually going to spend that revenue? Right? In particular, there might be a disconnect between what you want to spend the money on and what citizens would like you to spend the money on. Right? So citizens may often want public goods, they want hospitals, they want roads, they want education, and government might have its own priorities. In some cases, this can be completely altruistic. Right? You can imagine a case where the government knows that what it really needs is to update computer systems that are 40 years old, but that's probably not what citizens want you to spend the money on. They would prefer a new hospital. Right? But there's also versions of this where citizens want public goods, and what government would like is more rents, money lost to corruption, using the money to buy support in the next election, something like that. All that we really need here is some kind of disconnect between what citizens want and what government wants. Okay. So if we look at all these decisions, you can think of different combinations of them in different regime types. You can think about different ways that citizens could respond, and that's going to suggest a lot of possible outcomes. I want to focus on two that are kind of the most extreme in some ways. The first one is what I'm calling just a positive cycle, right? Citizens pay tax, the government decides to tax, citizens pay the taxes for one reason or the other. In return, they demand more from their leaders, government provides public goods, taxation remains. So we have high taxation, high state capacity, high accountability, everyone's happy. This is kind of the traditional taxation leads to accountability story. I think this is feasible, it does happen in some cases, but I don't want to ignore the second option. Right? Which is that you can get stuck in a negative cycle as well. So one option is that you try to tax, citizens pay the tax, they start demanding more of you, and in response you say, oh, actually, that's not what I wanted. That's not worth it. I'm just going to cut the tax altogether. And we've seen recently a lot of tax reversals in a lot of low and medium income countries. And then what happens after that is now we're in a cycle where citizens don't pay taxes, citizens don't demand accountability, and public goods provision remains low. And this is an equilibrium as well. So one of these is really good. One of these probably not what we wanted, right? So what determines when we're going to be in each of these? Because that really becomes the important question. When is taxation sustainable, and when would governments rather avoid taxation, avoid those accountability pressures? Okay. I want to talk about a couple of factors I think are important. The first one is basically what are citizens demanding in return and how feasible is it for the government to provide, especially given the revenue they're raising. I want to do that by talking through a couple of cases from my own work in Uganda and to some extent in Malawi. Okay. So in many African countries, one of the main sources of local revenue from government is taxes on market vendors. These are people selling everything from tomatoes to used computers, often open-air markets, sometimes in more kind of big indoor malls, and very often they pay a tax or a fee each day to sell in the market. And market vendors have some pretty interesting characteristics, if you're interested in things like taxation and tax bargaining. First of all, they're very well organized. Most markets have an elected market committee and a market lead. They actually liaise with the government. They help make demands on behalf of citizens. They understand what vendors need. Vendors are often very politically active. In my own survey work, they vote at much higher rates than other small entrepreneurs. And critically, they're willing to protest. There's some really fun stories from Uganda of there's a market in Kampala that I think has been burned down during vendor protests at least 3 times over the past 20 years. There's a case of government not providing services like trash pickup to a market where the market vendors get all the trash and go and throw it on the mayor's house. They won that one, and they got the trash back, right? So market vendors, very politically active, very well organized. And what they want in return from paying taxes is they want a clean, safe market. It's better for them health-wise, it's better for them economically. And the types of things that they want for that are things like a borehole or in more urban areas, a water tap. They want someone to pick up the trash. They want to have a security guard at night so they can leave their goods and not have to worry about them stolen. They're fairly simple goods. Most people agree on that is what they want, right? The result here is the positive equilibrium, where it's not going to be perfect, right? But in Uganda, most market vendors pay taxes. In Malawi, most markets are officially taxed, even if there's still compliance issues, right? And so we get something like a positive equilibrium here. There's another group of small businesses in Uganda that looks really similar on the surface, but you get very different outcomes. These are motorcycle taxi drivers known as boda boda riders. There's over 100,000 of them in Kampala, almost all young men. They're also really well organized. This is a boda boda stage on a corner. You have to officially be a member. There is a leader of the stage. They are organized into neighborhood and then ward and city groups. They have a lot of leadership. They are also politically active. They also vote at high rates. They're actually quite important in local elections in Uganda. And they are also very, very willing to protest. And they can get to the protest because they have a bike. Okay. They also want the same things, right? Again, when I've done surveys of boda boda riders, most of what they want is they want good roads because that's literally what they do all day is drive around on roads. To some extent, they also want healthcare. There's fairly high accident rates, unfortunately, for traffic in Uganda more generally, especially for these boda boda riders. But the result has actually been they've been very hard to tax. The Kampala City Council in the early 21st century tried to tax them multiple times with basically absolutely no success. Right. I would argue the big difference here is what they're demanding. If you look at the market vendors, what they want, they all agree on what they want, but what they want is fairly cheap to produce relative to the amount of money that market taxes raise. Building a new borehole costs, in Malawi, I can tell you from my own work, it costs about $5,000. Trash pickup, things like that are much, much cheaper than that. You can use a fraction of the market revenue to pay for public goods in the market. Roads are not cheap, right? Even if we're talking about an unpaved road, simply grading, creating a road, repairing it is incredibly expensive relative to what you can get from relatively poor boda boda riders. And so I think one of the big differences here is there kind of room to bargain? Can you actually meet these citizens' demands if you tax them? So when will citizens' demand be feasible, right? That's a very specific example. I think we can think about it a bit more generally by thinking about basically what's the marginal utility for citizens from every dollar that you're going to spend on public goods, right? And that's going to be affected by a few factors. First of all, it's going to agree on whether everyone agrees on the public good. It's going to be very depending on whether people agree on what they want. If half the people want roads and don't care about hospitals, and the other half care about hospitals and don't care about roads, even if you split it 50-50, the marginal utility most people get is going to be fairly low compared to if they all agree on what they want. It's also going to vary a lot based on basically production functions. How efficiently can the government provide public goods? If you have high capacity, if it's easy to do things like repair a feeder road, you have the whole system in place, contracting is easy, there's low levels of skimming off the top, that's going to be a lot cheaper than when state capacity is low. And then it may also depend on things like how geographically concentrated the tax base is. Boda boda riders are over this huge urban area of Kampala, compared to market vendors who are very geographically concentrated. It means you can basically build one borehole and give water to an entire market. Whereas to give roads to these motorcycle taxis, you'd have to build a huge road network in a way that's going to be much, much more expensive. So I think these basic dynamics can help us think through the types of taxes where it's going to be more politically feasible, right? And if you have a public good that's lumpy, where you can't just build 1 foot of road at a time as you get more revenue, you can see how these problems start to get a little compounded. And the result is some types of taxation are going to be a lot more politically feasible than others if it's easier to meet citizens' demands. The second factor I want to talk about is regime type, whether a country is a democracy or an autocracy or something in between. In the broader political economy literature, most literature until fairly recently argued that democracies should tax more than autocracies. If anyone's made you read Meltzer Richards at any point, you will understand why. One of the main arguments is that in a democracy, the average citizen is poor, they demand high redistribution, we're going to get higher rates of taxation, right? Now that's the classic story, but let's say we're thinking about a country that's introducing multi-party elections for the first time. Well, one of the things that does, by design, is that citizens now have an easier path to hold governments accountable. This could lead to more accountability, right? It could be governments say, okay, citizens are putting more demands on us, we need to start doing better in return. But the other possibility is that governments can start looking around and saying, are there ways to get citizens off our back? Are there ways to try and get citizens to make fewer demands on us? And one worry is that could actually lead governments to abolish certain types of taxes or try to systematically reduce the taxes that most citizens pay. It doesn't have to happen, but if you look, there's actually going to be cases where democratization is going to make taxation much harder to sustain. I think one nice example of that is the graduated tax in Uganda. Okay. This is a 1999 graduated tax ticket. This is one of the taxes that is a holdover from the colonial period, where it's simply a flat rate paid by all adult men. Technically, there's different income bands, but it's for most people, I think by 2001 was just 3,000 shillings a year in cash, no substitutes accepted. Okay. It is deeply unpopular. Usually when we talk about coercive taxation, we're talking about like fines or trying to get better information about revenue. This is armed tax collectors going to weddings and people running into the bushes to hide to evade them. This is probably one of the more coercive taxes I've ever run across. There's a lot of examples of tax collectors going to villages and all the adult men who haven't paid their tax just going and hiding in the bushes somewhere, right? Needless to say, it's deeply unpopular, but it persists for years. Most other countries that had graduated taxes during colonialism abolished them much, much earlier. Uganda's a late holdout. The reason it stays around so long is that it's a local government tax, and it's one of the few own sources of revenue that local governments have. It forms the vast majority of their discretionary budget. It's really, really important for local taxes and local revenues. What finally kills it is the advent of elections in Uganda. So Uganda reintroduces elections under Museveni in 1996. They become marginally more competitive in 2001, and then in 2005, there's a switch to multi-party elections. It becomes an election issue, and Museveni just unilaterally abolishes it leading up to the election. This is a stark issue, but it's actually part of a much broader pattern of what we see in Uganda over the late 90s and early 2000s. I think there's an argument to be made that primary school fees, when they're abolished, were also one of the few taxes that rural citizens paid. Health center fees are abolished in 2001, and in the early 2000s, property taxes on all homes outside Kampala are also abolished. So if you're a rural citizen, you've gone from paying, or someone in your household paying graduated tax, primary school fees, health center fees, and more, and potentially property tax, to basically paying no taxes at all. And this was actually one of the starting points for kind of this entire project, was talking to people in the broad sense that all these changes had really severed citizens from government, and it meant that yes, government was not bringing a lot of development, it wasn't doing much, but people weren't demanding much in return. The fact that the government was able to abolish all these taxes meant it was able to reduce accountability pressures dramatically. So that's the bad outcome. So do we think there's still cases where democratization can lead to higher taxation? I think the answer is yes, right? I think it's mainly going to be when, again, you can actually meet citizens' demands, right? If you can raise revenue enough that you can actually provide citizens with the types of public goods they want and still have something left over for the government's own priorities, then I think that's going to be more likely to see taxation. That in turn is going to value on, do citizens value public goods, right? So there's increasing work showing that when citizens have private alternatives to public goods, they might be more resistant to paying taxes. That could be a worry. It's going to lower the degree to which they value these public goods. I would argue that when state capacity is high, it's also going to be a lot easier because, again, you're going to be able to provide public goods a lot more efficiently. This is the only figure I'm going to show you tonight. It is from my book. This is just observational data collection. Just trust me, there's control variables and clustered standard errors and time trends and everything you want to see here. That's a sop to the economists. So on the x-axis, we have GDP per capita. On the y-axis, we have basically the marginal effect of polity. And what we're looking at is, as a country becomes richer, what's the predicted effect of an increase in democracy on tax GDP ratios? And what we can see is for poor countries, it's either slightly negative or mostly a null, where we're not really seeing democracy lead to higher taxation. Whereas as countries get wealthier, that's where we really see the positive effect. Right? So a lot of the prior literature arguing that democracies tax more, rich democracies tax more. Poor democracies do not tax more. In fact, at the lowest levels, they might even tax slightly less. Okay. So where does that leave us? I do still think taxation is absolutely critical for state capacity. It's absolutely critical for accountability, but that's only going to happen when it's politically feasible. Whether it's feasible in turn, I think is going to depend a lot on who you're trying to tax. Again, governments have a lot of choices for different tax instruments and the types of things they want in return. If governments can satisfy citizens' demands, then I think we can potentially see taxation. We can see it leading to higher accountability. But that may depend a lot on state capacity. Also might depend on how pressing the need for taxes is. If you can't do anything without raising taxes, if you've been cut off from borrowing, cut off from aid, if the price of oil crashes, maybe that's going to be more attractive, but I think that's something we don't have super strong answers for, right? I haven't talked much about tax modality. I do actually think the type of tax matters a lot. One other possibility here is what governments do is they see which types of taxes generate the fewest accountability demands from citizens and really focus on those. So I have some other work showing that indirect taxes do actually seem to be less visible to citizens, and that seems to dampen the accountability pressures. So when we're thinking about taxation, the other possibility is governments we might find taxes that are easier to institute, but those very taxes might have smaller spill-on effects for things like accountability. And I think we need to think about that in a much broader context, depending on what the goals for higher taxation are. Right? But fundamentally, the argument is that if we're trying to increase taxation, we need to think about the politics. We need to think about leaders' incentives. What I want to finish on is just throwing out things I would like to know the answer to, in the hopes that this can start some discussions over the next day or so. Right? I think one major question is when we're thinking about tax reform and tax administration and enforcement, how do we balance enforcing on big taxpayers with trying to broaden the tax net and bring more people into the tax net? Big taxpayers are really attractive for a lot of reasons, right? You get a lot of revenue for each taxpayer. You can actually get to start paying their taxes. Work on tax fairness suggests that if people think everyone's paying their fair share and you have really high visibility cases of making sure there's tax compliance at the highest level, that could have positive effects for taxation more broadly. But at the same time, you'd probably expect that even if tax GDP went up a lot, you wouldn't see a ton of effects on things like accountability. If you're trying to broaden the tax net, bring in the informal sector, you're talking about a much smaller amount of revenue. You'd have to tax a lot of micro-entrepreneurs to make up for one big taxpayer. At the same time, those are the taxes that might actually have the biggest effects on accountability. And potentially bigger effects on state capacity because of what you'd have to do to actually bring those people into the tax net. The solution's obviously some mix of these, but in terms of how we should balance them, if you have a limited amount of money to invest in tax capacity, tax administration, where should you put your efforts? I think we need to think about how to balance these a bit. The question I actually think the most about right now is the role of debt. In political economy and economics, there's a huge literature on sovereign borrowing, there's a huge literature on taxation, there's a huge literature on spending. We don't always talk about how debt interacts with the other two very much. And since COVID, government borrowing has gone up dramatically, not just for low and middle income countries, but across the board. US debt is now the largest we spend more on interest payments than we do on the military. And I think it's really important to think about how this is going to affect both the willingness of government to tax, but also citizens' resistance to taxation. We can see on the willingness side that if you're in fiscal crisis, and maybe that's the time where you do actually really start needing to raise tax revenue. But if you're a citizen, and we think citizens are going to demand more in return, your fiscal space has just shrunk. Instead of saying, pay taxes so we can provide public goods, now you're saying, pay taxes so we can pay interest on our debt and pay back the IMF. That's probably a harder sell. And we just don't have a lot of work on it. Is this how citizens think? Is this how governments think? We don't know a lot. So I'm actually working in a project in Ghana on this right now. Okay. We also haven't talked much, I haven't let you all talk at all, about decentralization and taxation, right? So some of the taxes I've been talking about are about the local government, some are about the national government, and local governments are often the ones providing a lot of this absolutely visible frontline service provision that citizens rely on, especially in rural areas. At the same time, local governments in many countries rely really heavily on central transfers and have very little own source revenue. But this own source revenue is really the only way to fund local priorities the national government may not care about. It's also the only way to maintain a lot of public goods. A lot of central government funding in, say, Uganda goes to, say, building a new school, a new hospital. When the roof falls off the old one, it's local revenues that are going to fix this. This makes local revenue in particular really critical, but it can also lead to competition between different levels of government over different tax bases. I'd like to see a lot more work on whether certain taxes work better at certain levels than others. Do we actually see some of these taxation accountability patterns, the positive patterns, more likely to hold at the local level? Or is this something where it's actually easier to bring people into the tax net at the local level and we can use that to build national tax capacity? But understanding more about this of local national interaction with taxation I think is really important. And the last one is also kind of on the local side, but really thinking about how politicians and bureaucrats interact, particularly with regard to taxation. There's a stylized story of local taxation that I've heard over and over again talking to local tax officials in Uganda and to some extent Malawi, which is I go talk to the bureaucrats and they tell me, we need more taxes and we know exactly how to do it. This is not hard. We know how to increase tax revenue. We know how to start enforcing this. The politicians just won't let us. They're worried about what's going to happen. I mean, in some cases, the politicians might be right? If you're trying to increase taxes a lot and not provide anything in return, maybe they should be worried. But I also think there's room for another answer here, and this is drawing on a lot of Pia Raffler's work on politician-bureaucrat interactions. The politicians may actually lack a lot of technical skills. They are not trained accountants. They are not here at the CDE getting trained. They may have much lower levels of education on average. And they're worried about consequences from citizens, and they may not even be totally sure how to evaluate those. They just know that they're there. And that gap, I think, could potentially create space for some kind of intra-government negotiation between politicians and bureaucrats trying to understand how to both structure taxation and how to structure spending in ways that can hopefully meet citizens' demands and see whether there is a way out of some of these low accountability equilibria. Okay. I'm going to stop there, but I really hope that I can talk to all of you over the next day. If you think I'm right, I'd love to hear from you. I'd also love to talk to you if you think I'm absolutely wrong about everything I've said so far. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you. So we have some time for questions. So if you have a question, I'll bring the microphone to you. Please say your name and where you're from. And, all right, Tushin, looks like you have a question. It's on already.
Oh,
just hold it up to your mouth.
Thank you for your presentation. I have completely understood in your presentation because I work at the Ministry of Finance. Yeah. My name is Tushi. I'm from Mongolia, and I'm from CDE. And I have a question. My question is, in my country, it's like in 2023, its tax revenue is like contributed the large share of the tax revenue to VAT. Maybe it's overall 30%. And then in your presentation, the green one is my Mongolia. Yes, tax revenue is independence. And my question is, we are built in modern electronic tax system very quickly since 1990. And then, but still we have just struggles with the commodity dependence. The question is, does the state capacity follow the tax reforms, or does it have to come first? Thank you.
Thank you. So the question is, does state capacity need to follow tax reforms or precede it? I would love to know the answer to that. Give me a second. It's hard, right? I think we're used to, at least in political science, a lot of literature has historically seen state capacity as an exogenous variable. It's just states either have high capacity or low capacity. I think we're starting to get a sense that state capacity is a bit more of a choice, at least in some ways. You can often see that governments with low capacity in one area might actually have very high capacity for something like, say, the security sector, where they have much more incentives to invest in it. That certainly suggests to us that tax capacity can shift. We've also certainly seen historically that states were able to go from low tax to high tax equilibriums when they had to. In some ways, I think this is a hard question to answer because we often think of state capacity as literally the ability to tax. So in that way, they're always going to go together. I think this is a case where the will, to the extent that we think state capacity is being hampered by things like non-meritocratic bureaucracies, that seems like something that ultimately would have to be more of a political choice, right, where you can do that before other changes happen. At the same time, as the state gains capacity, you could see a situation where citizens' expectations start to go up, and that leads for pressure for tax reform. So the answer could be that it might depend on the type of pressures that are leading to that reform. But it's something that I don't, others may know much more about this, but it's something where I don't have a good sense for empirically what we actually tend to see.
Hi. Hey, Lucy. Jim Mann here, Political Science Department. You mentioned about the large taxpayer units and how they're maybe not the best way to get some kind of accountability. And I just wondered, turning to questions of development now, your economic development, and maybe a little bit less to development of regimes or development of democracy. For many governments, one of the biggest problems of state capacity is the reliable protection of property rights. And you would think that big taxpayers would have a stake in this. And I just wondered if, in your experience, does it require something else, like a peak organization or something? Or is it just doesn't happen because they come to some understanding with the tax man and nothing happens in the institutions?
You mean in terms of, so basically with even if there's not tax bargaining writ large, could you bargain with large taxpayers for better protection of property rights?
Right.
Yeah, my sense is they tend to be able to get those anyway. In a lot of cases, the ones who are regime aligned presumably can. I have not worked directly with big taxpayers, right? So this is more thinking more kind of logically about what I think the incentives would be. If you're if you're wealthy and you're aligned with the regime, you can probably get those through other channels. If you're wealthy and you're not aligned with the regime, you're probably paying your taxes anyway, or aggressively siphoning your money out. The international tax regime is a whole separate question. I will say with property rights, I think a lot of the property rights issues that I've seen, again, because I'm working more with low-level taxes, is that property rights are a prerequisite of the rich. That things like having a title to your land is something that's out of reach for a lot of people, which is really going to hamper things like economic development, but also things like property tax if you don't even have a title to your land, whereas that's something the rich can access much more easily. So I don't know if that actually answers your question or not, but...
Hello, I'm Alia from Pakistan, and I'm fellow at CDE. Throughout the presentation, I have observed that you focus that whenever there are tax reforms, they should be backed by the political willingness or political incentives which are involved. What I see in my country, and maybe it's the problem in most of the developing countries, is the development of tax culture. So I just want to know your opinion that whenever we talk about the tax reforms, so tax reforms that they usually cover that broadening of tax base should be considered, tax rates should be, they need to be reconsidered. Has ever been in any country the tax reforms been discussed, or have they been considered to inculcate this tax culture thing or to increase the tax morale? Because that's, I think, that's the point in which most of the developing countries, including Pakistan, it's lacking. So I want to know your take on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so when we're thinking about tax reform, we often think about these mechanics, but there's also just, are citizens willing to pay? Do they actually have some kind of tax morale or sense of an obligation? There's been an increasing amount of experimental work on this. So I've done a bit of work on this, so have I think many others in this room, on basically looking at different ways to increase tax compliance on the ground. I think we're starting to actually build a pretty good body of evidence. There was some early work that was mostly null findings, showing that if you basically tell people, hey, you should pay your taxes, it's a really good thing to do, that doesn't do anything. But there's been a lot more successful experiments recently doing things like trying to actually increase public goods provision. So I've done some work in Malawi where we looked at different ways to increase tax compliance in markets, looking at enforcement versus basically fairly explicitly doing tax bargaining and higher public goods provision. And we found the second approach worked a lot better. There's some interesting work on Haiti. The tax enforcement campaigns only really worked in Haitian cities when they were also combined with higher public goods provision. When you didn't, it basically led to citizens building barricades to keep out the tax collectors, and a lot of anti-government graffiti. And there's been a lot of work in the DRC and other places suggesting that really most of the successful interventions I know of are ones that actually increase public goods. What's hard about that is that increasing public goods costs money, and if you don't have the taxes, how do you increase the money? How do you increase the goods, right? So I know in Malawi, we were working with a USAID project where there was external donor funding with the goal of actually increasing tax capacity domestically. But I think that kind of leads to this very chicken and the egg problem. But at least what I think was interesting, though, is in Malawi, what we saw is we were able to bargain between taxpayers and local government, agree on the public goods they wanted, and then we saw a tax increase before the public good was actually provided even. Just basically like, we have a plan, we are building this well, we are going to start picking up trash, things like that. And so I think that potentially is a way forward, but there has to be, I think trying to improve tax morale without increasing the actual services citizens see seems to be very, very, very difficult from the evidence that I've seen.
A lot of the dynamics that you discussed sort of are predicated on voters having pretty realistic expectations. You know, either they pay more taxes and they get better public services, or they pay less taxes and service provision suffers. And I'm wondering about, are there cases where voters have unrealistic expectations? Do they desire a free lunch? They want high quality public services that they're not willing to pay for. Have you observed that at all empirically? And could you sort of walk us through how that changes the incentive structures and the game theory?
Yeah, so what you're talking about is what's often called a fiscal illusion, that people don't internalize the full costs of what they're doing. You often see this cited for intergovernmental taxes for central transfers, that if you have a state that's paying less in income taxes that's receiving back in transfers, that people think they're paying more than they are, right? So people have pretty unrealistic expectations. I think there's also a broader issue of when you're talking about government budgets, the numbers are just stupidly large. Like, even if you ask me to guess to an order of magnitude what the budget of North Carolina is, I'd probably get it wrong. If you ask me what you could actually do with that money, I think that's incredibly difficult. And I think that makes it hard to set expectations, because asking the average citizen, how many schools can the government build this year? Or how many teachers can we pay? That's just really, really abstract numbers at that point. My gut sense, and I don't have any empirical backing for this, is mainly people just want to see that things are getting better. Right, they're getting some value for money. The other place where the kind of free lunch kicks in is I'm actually doing some work in the US right now with a co-author looking at how people think about government borrowing and the worry there's a free lunch there. So far, what we found for that is, at least in the US, where my gut was that no one thinks about debt ever, is that people are actually fairly worried about government borrowing. They think it has negative consequences. It's just that they're also really worried about fiscal adjustment and what the effects are going to be on them. So in a broad sense, I would say from kind of empirically and just thinking through incentives, citizens probably have a broad sense, are they getting something in return, right? They're probably anchoring pretty heavily on what the past has looked like or what they're seeing in, if you're talking about local government, what you're seeing in neighboring governments. A lot of the accountability work suggests that telling people how their local government is doing relative to neighbors is much more effective than just telling them in absolute terms, because it's really hard for citizens to evaluate those numbers. And so it might be a little, so it's hard to even know what it would mean for citizens to have realistic perceptions. I think that we're probably looking at something where it's a bit more heuristic and a bit more kind of anchoring based on, do I feel like is my gut sense that I'm getting enough back in return?
Thank you for a great talk. You highlighted some situations that look very similar, with positive equilibria and some with negative equilibria. And the missing sauce seems to be what economists call institutions. But it seems like I still cannot point out here what it is. So is your lesson that we need to know better what institutions are, where they come from, or is there something more to know what situation are we going to get to a positive equilibrium or a negative equilibrium?
Yeah, so in terms of when we get sort of these good outcomes, these bad outcomes, I think institutions are important, right? I would consider sort of regime type one of these key institutions. State capacity is obviously kind of formed based on the institutions of the state. I'm going to say it's officially past my bedtime now. So if my brain starts to slow down, that is why. Where was I going with that? But okay, how do we get from one to the other, right? What's hard is that some of these are, you have a leader who's in power. In some cases, you might have some control over that. We can try and elect better leaders. In some countries, you don't have much say over who the president is, right? If we're talking about an electoral autocracy or something where elections are not so free and fair, or you might have two candidates, both of whom are roughly the same on a lot of these. I think one of the lessons, I think, is you can still take away in that kind of setting is that if we're thinking about how tax reforms, especially one of the IFIs is thinking about tax reforms, if foreign donors are thinking about tax reforms, because often the reforms we see are being pushed by international agencies, that we need to think carefully about which ones are going to succeed or fail depending on what actually seems politically feasible. Right? If an institution goes all in on a particular type of tax reform, that it's clear that if you stop and think about it, the government is never going to go for, then that's going to be problematic, right? It could also lead to if you think there's a type of taxation that's incredibly important, but there are these issues of governments don't want to do it because they're worried about accountability demands, is there a way out of it? So I mentioned the experiment on tax compliance in Malawi. That's part of what we were trying to do, is we're stuck in a situation where government says we can't provide public goods because there's no money. Citizens say we would like to pay taxes, but only if we get public goods in return, and some small external amount of money was able to kind of boost that equilibrium a bit and provide some initial impetus to try and move from a bad equilibrium to a good equilibrium. So there's cases where you may not have very much control over domestic political institutions, over who the leaders are, but I think we can still think creatively about what's causing these bad equilibriums, right? That if it's something where we have kind of multiple political market failures as well as standard economic market failures, being able to evaluate in advance, do we think this project's going to be successful, or how could we design it differently to, say, get politicians on board and still try to have some kind of effects? I think that's one way to interpret this.
One last question, because it's my bedtime.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I have one question. Should taxation follow business cycles?
Yeah, I was gonna say that's a mean question to ask a political scientist, right? Should taxation follow business cycles? I'm really tempted to just start talking about political business cycles, which is basically spending around election, because there is evidence that governments enforce taxation less in the run-up to elections. Can you give me a bit of explanation about other reasons that you are thinking it's important?
I'll give a practical example to what
Yeah.
happened in Kenya during the pandemic period. The government would in a bid to protect the citizens, the government lowered the pay-as-you-earn taxes. So then once everything has picked up now, do you come and raise that taxes once the economy is booming?
Yeah. So there's one empirical example I think seems relevant for this, which is there's some interesting work on in Latin America on tax holidays, suggesting that people who randomly get a tax holiday are actually less likely to pay tax. They basically, if you have a system where there's one of these lotteries and you've paid your taxes for years and you win a tax holiday where you don't have to pay your property tax this year, those people are less likely to pay basically for the rest of their lives. We don't know that much, I'm exaggerating, but at least for the next couple of years, people went from basically being incredibly solid taxpayers paying every year to not paying tax as much. And I think there is a worry that expectations get formed, right? And that if you're in the habit of paying taxes and they're suddenly cut, that it might be very difficult to restart that. Also, theoretically, a lot of my work on taxation accountability demands is based on the idea of reference-dependent utility, where you start to kind of have some baseline of what you expect. And again, I would worry about lowering pay-as-you-earn as a way to do that. What we see in developed countries is typically kind of something a bit different, which is things like stimulus checks, right? Where you basically, you're still paying the same in taxes, but in return you're getting a check from the government. That's obviously much harder to do in a country where most people aren't paying pay-as-you-earn. But I could see a world where that would be have less effect on taxation in the long run. If it was something where you're still paying the tax, we're not changing the tax system, but you're getting some kind of additional rebate or something that year, something that seems more temporary and is more explicitly tied to some kind of crisis. What I know absolutely nothing about is whether that would be actually feasible to carry out, whether that would have the same effect on how people feel, because especially presumably part of this is during COVID, if it's pay as you earn, you're getting the money back every month rather than kind of just at tax season. And so you'd have to think carefully about feasibility of that. But again, my worry is that if you started to actually change tax rates around economic business cycles, that it would actually make taxation a lot harder in the long run.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.